and welcome to the Learning Future podcast. I'm your host, Luca Parry. Thank you for joining us. Today we're speaking with Dr. Addie Wootten. She is the CEO of Smiling Mind, a clinical psychologist that has been working for most of her career in clinical practice and research across a range of major hospitals in Melbourne, primarily focusing on supporting people with cancer through that time. Through that clinical career, she has seen firsthand the benefits that mindfulness can provide, and she's also been a practitioner using mindfulness in her work for many years. She's an experienced researcher and a fundraiser, and she leads a really dynamic team at Smiling Mind, which we're going to hear quite a lot more about. Addie, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I feel very honoured to be chatting with you today.
Well, I feel honoured to have you as a guest. I mean, delving into the realms of mindfulness and multidimensional human growth and development, well-being, we're going to cover all of it. And I'd love you to start with something you've learned recently.
Oh, gosh. It's a good question. I've got a couple of things. I've spent a lot of time in my garden over this pandemic, and I really love connecting with nature and the world, and I think that's what really grounds me. I spend a lot of time in my head in my work, so getting out and actually doing something physical. This is a very random thing that I've learned. I've learned how to put down gravel and then compact it, and I've learned how to use the machine that compacts the gravel. I felt pretty proud of myself to learn how to use that machine. Bit of a random.
I think I know the one
one,
you're talking about. Yeah, it's the one you press the button. It's like a compressor,
yeah,
compactor.
It vibrates it along. It's very funny. And the only reason I bring that up is because, like, immediately when you asked that question, I started thinking about my work and the complex stuff that we're dealing with. And I thought, oh, actually, no. I think I have to remind myself that learning happens all the time. Exactly. And it's often the small things that we learn that we kind of brush off and we don't take much heed of. So I'm teaching myself to pay attention more to those smaller things.
I love that, Addie. I love that concept that learning is an embodied act. We learn most powerfully by doing. I mean, it's
absolutely
it's not a controversial statement, I don't think. And returning back to the senses and the multi-dimensions, ultimately being mindful, perhaps one might say.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, isn't that, of course, that's part of what we do. So it's ever present for us. Yeah. And then I think, on a bigger scale, I have learned, or maybe it's been reinforced recently that mental health, I spend a lot of time thinking about, and I've learned, in fact, I probably learn every day, that mental health is a really difficult thing to define and to give meaning around, because everyone has their own different perspective and definition of what mental health is. So I constantly fall into this a bit of a trap of trying to define what it is, and then I get challenged again by someone else's perspective and thinking process. So that is definitely a space that I'm constantly learning, even though it's what I spend most of my time thinking about.
Yeah, which is this wonderful thing. I often think the minute we think we've arrived, or that we've worked it out, it's probably not the case in our complex, evolving world, particularly when it comes to the human condition as it might be described. Take us into your world a bit more, Addie. Tell us first, what is Smiling Mind and what is the work that you do?
Yeah, so Smiling Mind is an amazing organisation. We're almost 10 years old, so still pretty young in the scheme of organisations. We're a not-for-profit, so set up really with the vision to try and make a difference in the world. And the area that we focus on is mental health and wellbeing, through a whole range of different lenses, really. Right from the start, our focus has been children and young people. How do we help bring a different perspective to mental health through doing? So teaching people strategies and approaches that they can apply to their everyday life, and trying to do that in a really human, normal, everyday way. Not being too complex, trying to break things down into simple activities that we can all hopefully bring into our lives. And mindfulness has been a really core part of that. So introducing mindfulness to young people in a really accessible way, using technology to do that. So most people, if they've heard about Smiling Mind, will have heard of the Smiling Mind app. We've got about almost 7 million people that have downloaded that app now, which
Wow.
is
Congratulations.
amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's huge. More than 2 million of them have come in the last 18 months. So we know that people
Interesting.
over this pandemic have really been searching for tools that they can use. But overall, our work as an organisation is to try and make a difference to the way we all feel. We know that mental health, or the experience of mental health and the experience of mental illness and psychological distress is a big challenge for lots of us, and it isn't getting any better, unfortunately. We're seeing really high rates of distress. And so our philosophy is, if we can get in early and we can help young people learn about their own mental well-being, how they work, help them figure out, what is their role in this world? How do they want to connect with people? What are their values? If we can instill some of that thinking from a really young age, hopefully we can start to create a generational change in the way we experience mental health. And I think we're starting to see that as young people are growing up, we're seeing more openness to talk about mental health and well-being, and more curiosity around emotions and all of those really big things. So yeah, we do lots of work in schools. We run programs across the country, and we have programs and resources, primarily digital programs and resources for families to use, and then for workplaces to use. So we're trying to cover a whole range of stages of life, I suppose, is our thinking. If we can support people with practical tools and strategies that they can use in lots of different areas of their life, then hopefully we'll start to see a big shift.
Well, that's great, Addie. I came across the work of Smiling Mind, 6 or 7 years ago, I guess now, and I saw it as an hour. I thought, wow, this is an interesting thing to do, because as a teacher, most initial teacher education, at least I'll speak from the past tense, the ones that I have experienced, didn't talk very much about mindfulness, didn't look at really kind of the mental health, mental wellness, mental ill health spectrum very strongly. And so just share a little bit, as from your work as a psychologist, but also as kind of leading the great team there. Why is it that we see mental health getting worse? Like what actually is driving that? Because some of the data, and you may want to share this, it's not great news, actually. It's like, well, how is, we're meant to be growing, successful, economic development, et cetera, and yet this is also growing.
Yeah. It isn't a good news story at all. It's, we know 1 in 7 primary school children, 1 in 4 secondary school children experience mental illness, and that's a diagnosed mental illness.
Right.
And so if you think about the range of mental health challenges and distress that sits, outside of that clinical diagnostic range, most of us will either have experienced or know someone very close to us that is really struggling. We know that suicide rates are at an all-time high, and we're not really yet to see the impact of the pandemic, I don't think. It's encouraging that we haven't seen a really big spike in suicide, but I think what we are seeing is really complex responses. So I think we will start to see more traumatic responses, really complex experiences for people, particularly kids who maybe haven't been able to make sense of the world as it changed so rapidly. I think there's no one answer to why. It's a really complex question, and that I think there are lots of influences. So on the one hand, we know that mental health challenges have, they're part of the human condition. We have always experienced them, and what we know is that people are more open and are seeking help more readily than they did in generations gone past. And so that's one of the reasons why statistically there is a rise.
Yeah.
But I think above and beyond that, we're living in a much more complex world. There are so many things that come our way that we have to balance and juggle. And I think part of that has also led to a bit of a disconnection from ourselves and a feeling of knowing who we are and why we exist and our role in this world. And so that disconnection, I think, has a huge role to play in how we're feeling. We know social isolation and loneliness is at an all-time high as well, and that was before the pandemic. So I think people are, even though we're more connected than we've ever been in our history, people are feeling more disconnected. And so for me, that means we really have to stop and check in and figure out, well, how do we reconnect with ourselves and try and avoid those comparisons that, make us feel like we should be happy all the time, that we should have the best house, the best car, the best family, like all of those social norms that are so visible through lots of channels. I think, we need to take stock, I think, and figure out how do we live our lives in a much more compassionate, with gratitude for what we have. We have this amazing abundance, many of us here in Australia in particular. How do we change the way we look at our world? And I could go on and on and on.
That's
There's
so
a
great,
whole lot of
Addie.
things.
I think it's that internal orientation. It's such an interesting perspective, and I've been meditating now since 2016 when I did a meditation course in Melbourne.
Yeah,
your
good
home.
work.
I know, and I mean, and I was for a long time I thought, oh, that's all a bit woo-woo and a bit, that's a bit like go to a day spa kind of stuff. I used to play Aussie Rules footy, I was one of the guys. But what I've realized is just how incredibly powerful it is to realize that we are not our emotions, and this idea of the separation and being able to kind of quite literally focus the mind to kind of train the mind.
Well, we get so caught up. I mean, emotions are so strong, aren't they? And we can get pushed around. And it's not until you do learn how to take stock and to check in and to observe rather than respond or react, that you even grow that awareness. And I agree with you. I always felt like meditation was always a bit too, I don't know, we were a bit too spiritual for my thinking. But, I think it's not until you try it that you, and you learn how it can work for you. I mean, the way people bring meditation and mindfulness into their life can be very different for different people. So you have to find the right way for you.
Yeah, it's certainly very, very much becoming mainstream now because people are seeing the evidence behind it. I think is pretty overwhelmingly compelling. And, when you have, I think it was 90% of Silicon Valley CEOs meditate because it increases their performance. Now, the question is, should it be used as a vehicle to do more? Well, probably not. But, again, we're seeing this kind of, this is very much being thrust into the mainstream, which is necessary as perhaps a way to counter the kind of increasing stress and allostatic load that most of us have just through living in a complex, uncertain world where things might be this way today and they're definitely going to be a different way tomorrow.
Different, exactly. Or to help us make choices about what we want out of life as well. Mindfulness can be used in that way to help us build our performance and productivity, and that's definitely one pathway. But it also can give us space to make changes in our lives as well. And even for kids to be aware of that, when you're teaching these ideas to children and for them to say, well, I actually have decided that I don't want to be friends with that group of people anymore.
Sure.
I want to change that. And that awareness of knowing what works for you and what doesn't work for you and what you need to change in your life to to support your own well-being or to support the people around you that you care about is pretty powerful.
Yeah, fantastic. Take us, Addie, into some of the practices, like, the things that you could do. So you do so much work with schools. I think it was, I can't remember the data, like 1 in 3 Australian teachers have downloaded. It's something really high up there.
It's huge. It's actually more, almost half of all Australian teachers now
That is remarkable.
have
Yeah.
signed up to our app,
Yeah.
and they use it in different ways. So um, it is amazing. And I think back to your earlier point, Luca, the change that I have seen, even, I've been with Smiling Mind for 6 years now. So from when I joined in 2005 to now, the interest and the hunger to learn from schools and from teachers and principals has just, it has changed so much in that time. There's so much, there's such a great awareness of the need to support children in that broader sense of learning and development, and the connection between wellbeing and more traditional academic learning, I think, is so obvious now that if you can support kids in that holistic way, it actually results in a whole lot of benefits. So the practices are broad. So mindfulness is a practice of learning to pay attention, and the way we try and teach people to pay attention is to bring an attitude of openness, curiosity, and non-judgment. So in a nutshell, that's what mindfulness is from my perspective. And so what we're trying to do when we teach mindfulness through meditation practice with children is to give them opportunities to learn how to focus the mind, so to bring their full attention to one thing at one time, which we don't often get a chance to do. Many of us spend a lot of time multitasking. So it's creating space in the school day to do that, or the home time at home. And then we introduce concepts around that as well. So in the simplest form, if a school is bringing mindfulness into their school environment, it would be to find a regular time throughout the day for kids to stop and to do a meditation practice. And so lots of schools will use our app to guide a meditation. It might be 3 minutes, it might be 7 minutes. They're not very long, but it gives kids an opportunity to pause and reset. And if schools can do that at a regular, like in a routine, that routine actually starts to build that capacity. So, you, like anything, like learning how to run, or learning maths or reading and writing, you can't just do it once and you master it. You have to practice it. And mindfulness is exactly the same. So it's a skill that you need to work on. It's like training your brain. And so what we try and encourage schools to do is to have a routine around that, so that kids know when to expect it. And so what we see from teachers and schools is really they start to see calmer classrooms and more settled students is sort of the first phase, and that's usually coming from a regular mindfulness practice.
Great.
And then we've built a whole mindfulness curriculum for schools if they want to take it to another level, and that is built off social and emotional learning frameworks and underpinned by mindfulness. And so we take students through a process over the course of the year. And so it starts with awareness and getting to know your body and your emotions, like actually giving students the opportunity to check in and, feel when you feel sad, where do you feel it in your body? What does it feel like? And how do you start to put a language around that? How do you get kids talking about it? Because when we start to put language around emotions, it actually changes the way we understand emotions, and it gives power to know that you can actually do something about it. And then we move into thinking about how our mind and our body connect. So, what's the connection between our thoughts and thinking and how we feel? how do we start to look at our mindsets and different approaches? So we've integrated some positive psychology thinking in there around growth mindset. Like, how do we teach kids about, fixed versus growth mindset? And then we move into, broader things around social connection. So how do we introduce ideas around empathy and compassion to kids, perspective taking, and, putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, and bringing that sense of curiosity to other people's experiences, so you can build that sense of learning from other people. And ultimately, I suppose that all sort of ladders up to, for want of a better word, that idea of resilience. So how do you build all of these different skills and teach different things to kids that help them navigate challenges and be aware that, life will throw things up, and we will all have to navigate really challenging things. But knowing that you have a strong base in yourself and your community, the people around you, that you can navigate things. So yeah, that's a mixture of like explicit learning and teaching. We leverage the teachers, so we really try and support teachers with as much stuff as we can, so that they feel comfortable teaching these topics, and then getting the kids to do things like you said earlier. Like, it's through the doing that kids start to learn what, how do you apply this to your life,
your own life. Addie, it's a fantastic answer. I'm curious about, because there's such a range of practices and programs, and we all need to start somewhere. And I wonder if we were to think into the future, perhaps, which I attempt to do sometimes, because it's impossible to predict. But what might be possible? I wonder how might schools that really embed mindfulness at their core, alongside the social and emotional capability and cognitive capabilities, all three of them. So it's not about excising one of them; it's about elevating the others for a kind of a future-focused, new economy, well-being kind of experience. What might that school kind of look like, do you think? What could it feel like into the future in 2030, let's say?
Yeah, well, we've done a lot of thinking about what will the world be like in 2030, and I'm definitely an optimist. I think what I would love to see are school environments where it's truly thriving. So I think one component of that is supporting our teachers and making sure that their well-being is at the forefront as well, because they play such an important role in modelling and nurturing our future generations. So we need to look after the teachers, and we need to look after the school leaders and the whole school community. But for me, it's a community of learning where we can actually tailor and work with individual learning needs. So I think and we're already seeing that, a move away from the one size fits all kind of learning approach, to getting to know that we are different in the way we learn, and tapping into that and learning how we can create learning journeys and pathways for students that really play to what is needed for those students. And for me, that is holistic. So that is, we're whole people. We can't break it apart and say, well, you just have to learn reading, writing, and arithmetic, and, off you go. We have to think about how we're developing humans in the school environment, and different areas of strength will come out of that, and that's good as well. That there are different ways that we can support success, for in inverted commas. So I think for me, it's about creating school environments where there are really positive things happening. We're nurturing well-being at all levels of that school environment. We're engaging parents and making sure that parents are connected to learning, because when kids go home, that learning continues, doesn't it? And I think more and more parents are really really embracing their role and wanting to really support their kids in their development as well.
Addie, I think let's talk on this parent piece specifically, because a lot of people listening to this podcast, even if they're educators, are also parents.
Of course.
There is this, I'm not yet, by the way, just for the record, but I think there's this, schools were never designed with parental inclusion at the core. And so the pandemic has definitely shifted that in a significant way. Great schools were always really good at engaging parents, but in some ways they were doing so with difficulty against the structures of the school, because the school model has been set for a different paradigm, for a kind of somewhat of an economic purpose. So how might we better think around the kind of ecosystem, the multi-stakeholders here? What are you seeing in terms of do you have students go back and teach the parents around mindfulness? I mean, because how do we think about this as a whole school community as the way to actually think about human growth and development?
Yeah, and I think the pandemic, I mean, maybe this is going to be one amazing thing out of the pandemic. I have not homeschooled during the pandemic,
right.
But I don't have kids. But I know there were so many challenges for families, particularly in states where we had long lockdowns. I'm based in Melbourne, so we've had many months of homeschooling. So it's been really, really hard. But one of the things I think that might come out of this experience is the connection with the role that parents really want to play in their children's learning and development. And we've definitely seen this huge demand from parents looking for help to practical things, or how can I help my kids process what's going on? How can I help them understand and deal with what emotions they're going through, and talk about it, and give me a framework, or something that can help me deal with this with our family. So I think that's really powerful. So maybe out of this pandemic there will be more parent involvement. And I think so. And I think the opposite is definitely true. We already see kids going home and introducing mindfulness to their family. It's really interesting. We run a workplace program as well, and often when we run programs in businesses, we half of the room will say, "Oh yeah, we do this already at home because my kids brought it home from school."
Fantastic.
It's amazing. So yeah, I think we will see that change. I think schools have an opportunity to think about how you explicitly engage parents without it feeling like onerous homework.
Yeah.
But how do you? I think a lot of parents are looking for guidance and learning opportunities themselves. We don't do parenting classes, and we don't learn how to help develop our kids' social and emotional skills over time. That's not something that you kind of learn as you go, right?
True,
so how do you help give, if you have an explicit program within your school environment, how do you introduce that to your parents as well, so that they can, if they want to, they can continue that at home?
Fantastic, Addie. Take us, just because we're on this piece, what resources do you actually provide? Because the app is a free app, as far as I can tell. It's a download
It
initially,
is.
and then take us. People listening to this might be like, great, I'm going to give it a try with my students and my parents, or I know this, I'm going to come back to it. How do they find out?
That is a very good question. So yes, the Smiling Mind app is free. You will not get upsold or anything. You don't have. It's not a limited time thing. It is free because we believe it should be accessible to as many people as possible.
Right.
And that's the beauty, I suppose, of being a not-for-profit. We can we do it for that reason. Then if you're in a school environment, or you're a parent wanting to talk to your school, there's lots of other ways that schools engage with our programs. So we run professional learning programs for teachers, and that really is around how do you do this? How do you bring mindfulness into your school? how does it map to social and emotional learning frameworks that you might already have in the school environment? And then we have a whole school program. So that's where our mindfulness curriculum comes in. There's lots of teaching and learning resources. And actually, our team is doing amazing work at the moment to build a full digital curriculum. So from term 1 next year, schools will be able to log into our new big learning hub and get access to a whole lot of other resources. So the best way to find out more about that is to come onto the Smiling Mind website, which is smilingmind.com.au. And the same for parents. There's heaps of free resources on the Smiling Mind website for parents. We responded really quickly to the pandemic, and so there's lots of, we've called them care packs or kids learning packs, and so they were developed quickly to try and get really practical tools in the hands of as many families as possible. And so they link to the meditations in the app, but they're really practical things. So, can you sit down with your children and draw an emotion diagram of, where do they feel emotions in their body?
Right.
How do we give tools to kids and parents that can actually facilitate a conversation and get some conversations and talking about how you're feeling going? And then some really practical things like going on a curious walk. So how do you go out into the backyard and actually foster that sense of awareness and curiosity and collect things that you might not normally see or you might walk past without noticing? And so they're strategies that are designed to help build awareness and pause and slow down our stress response so that we're learning how to regulate.
And I think that's a wonderful connection to make to something you said earlier, Addie, about resilience. And everyone knows the word resilience because people say it all the time.
Yeah.
But the question is, well, how do we become resilient? Like, where's the program for resilience? Where's the resilience button that I can press? And now it really does, in my view, and it sounds like the work you do there, which is evidence-based, it's understanding the constructs that contribute to self-regulation that actually then can manifest as resilience. And I'm also taken by some conversations I've had with Frank Oberclade, who is a wonderful contributor to Smiling Mind as well. And the idea of a mental wellness, a mental health spectrum. And so the idea that, we can be healthy, we can be coping, we can be struggling, or we can be unwell. And in fact, all of us will be those things at some point in our lives because of life. And so it's kind of how do we find our way back through the support networks that we have, through the practices that we have, through the systems that we use, and how we design kind of schools, workplaces, communities, where that can all direct us back to that place, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, resilience is a funny one, isn't it? Like, and we hear politicians talking about, well, we just need to be more resilient.
Yeah.
Which is, it's great until you stop and you think, well, what is resilience and how do we become more resilient? And often people talk about becoming more resilient when they've gone through something really hard. So the pandemic will be one of those things for sure. Yeah. But prior to that, it will have been going through the bushfires, I think. That's has right. Built it's had a traumatic impact, and it has probably also resulted in a different level of resilience for some communities. And there's lots of other things. We will all go through things that are challenging for us, but there's a difference between the traumatic pathway and feeling traumatized by something and the resilience pathway. And I think the difference for me is the resources and the capability, the capacity for us to make sense of what's going on and to not feel overwhelmed by what's going on. And to do that, we need skills to manage it, because that isn't taught to us explicitly. And for some of us, we learn it on the go, and we're able to navigate through things. But that doesn't come naturally to most of us. So how do we actually explicitly teach the skills that we need to build that resilience, that will hopefully start to help us reduce the traumatic impact.
That's wonderful, Addie. I want to add one more thing to this and just get your quick response. sometimes when you talk about mindfulness, people see it as non-rigorous, right? Or they see it,
Yeah,
our skills. What are
just
these mindfulness
relaxing.
skills? Yeah,
Yeah.
having a sleep? Wow, what's that for? So, and yet, from what we know from the field of social and emotional learning, for example, is when you teach some of these skills explicitly, as you say, they have an enormous impact on ability to cope, but also ability to perform academically. And so I think, and I just wanted to put this on record again, as I often do. I mean, this is a very this is rigor. This is evidence based. This is not.
Yeah.
Let's all just sit in a circle and have a sing along, which, by the way, also has a positive influence on
It can,
climate and culture.
definitely.
On everybody's mood repair and a whole bunch of other things. But no, this is actually very rigorous work. And when we talk about skills for the new economy in particular, and being able to step into a workforce where you have to constantly adapt and be agile, these are the skills we're talking about. And I think that's just such an important thing for us to understand. It's a false dichotomy sometimes we get stuck in, I think. Is it well-being or is it, learning? Well, actually, they are exactly the same thing if we think of them in the right way, in my view.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so, yeah, couldn't agree more. Mindfulness isn't passive. It's not about lying down and relaxing and daydreaming. It's about consciously focusing and strengthening certain parts of our brain that then have an impact on the rest of our body and how we interact with the world. And there's a huge amount of science now that has really strengthened the importance of why these skills are foundational, really, for our ability to navigate the world. Like coping with uncertainty is, one part of that, and that what you just described then around the future of being agile and having to adapt to things quickly requires really deep emotional intelligence and capacity to tolerate all of those competing things. So we have to teach these skills, or we will continue to see the mental health challenges that we're seeing escalate, and our ability to feel good in that new working environment will be so challenging because it's not the way we're built as humans. We have to train ourselves.
Yeah, Addie, it's been such a privilege to connect with you again and hear some of the work that Smiling Mind is doing and that you're doing as well. Just share your take-home message for our listeners today. What's something you want to leave us with?
Well, it's a great question. I think for me, it's about thinking about this stuff, even though it's hard, early. So I think we have a tendency to only respond to things when there's a problem, and particularly when it comes to our mental health and well-being. So for me, my take-home message would be, think about how you can bring this into your life on a day-to-day basis, and don't wait until you're struggling to do it, because the more we can think proactively about these types of things, the better the outcomes will be for individuals, but also for our society as a whole. I think we need to really switch it around and, prioritize this stuff as much as we do our exercise, our, academic learning, our work life. It's such an important thing to think about as part of our everyday routine.
Dr. Addie Wootten, thank you so much for joining us for the Learning Future podcast today.
Thanks, Luca. Great to be here.